When the holidays start to feel a bit repetitive, reach for a Sprite Winter Spiced Cranberry and put your twist on tradition. A bold cranberry and winter spice flavor fusion, Sprite Winter Spiced Cranberry is a refreshing way to shake things up this sipping season. And only for a limited time. Sprite. Obey your thirst.
Oh, Hilton stay, your beds are soft and cozy. No lumpy couch, no stiff futon, no shower line at crack of dawn. Oh, Hilton stay, a holiday you're saving.
When you want holiday comfort you can count on, it matters where you stay. This season, enjoy spacious, comfortable rooms and friendly service when you book with Hilton instead. Hilton for the stay.
This is the Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I'm very happy to welcome back, once again, Matt Lewis. Welcome back.
Hello. I'm very much the bad smell you can't get rid of at the moment, aren't I?
Matt, I was not expecting. I always enjoy having you on the show. I feel like we have a good time. You can pretty much talk about anything medieval. And that is an area that I'm fascinated with, but I don't necessarily know nearly enough. And you are, to me, the expert on medieval stuff. So I asked you back. The last episode that we did was Henry III. Who the hell is he, or was he? And during that episode, I said I wanted to talk about Edward I because he is another one. And I think really I want to know, why was he such a tyrant? I feel like that's the theme for today's episode. Am I wrong in thinking that he was a tyrant?
Who is this monster? It depends who you ask. I mean, if you ask anyone in Wales or Scotland, probably still today, they will say absolutely yes, he's a tyrant and a monster. There are many ways in which he ticked a lot of the boxes for an ideal medieval king, though. So perhaps if you're English during his reign, you're probably thinking he's less of a tyrant and more of the kind of leader that you wanted, albeit that any leader who's gone to war is costing you an awful lot of money, which is tax money, which is never going to be popular either. So I don't know that the English would ever have described him as a tyrant. Plenty of people, I think, would have. It's a reputation that stuck with him mainly because of his successes in Wales and Scotland. And I also think there is an interesting point when his wife passes away in 1290 that marks a fairly dramatic change in his personality, I think, as well. So there's contributory factors to what's going on with Edward, I think.
Okay. Well, we have to start from earlier on. We can't just jump forward right to him being a tyrant and why he was. So we talked about his father, Henry III. Let's talk about what Edward's life looked like under the reign of his father, because I feel like we only just kind of scratched the surface in the last episode. So was he, I assume he was the eldest son, or was he the eldest surviving son?
He's the eldest son of Henry III and Eleanor of Provence. He's born in June 1239, and his parents are generally considered to have been a good couple. They seem to have fostered a really close family. Edward has a number of brothers and sisters. And they all seem to get on incredibly well. I talked a bit about in the Henry III episode that one of Henry's daughters marries the King of Scotland, and that fosters a really close relationship between Scotland and England. Spoilers, it doesn't last. But Edward, I think, is raised in this environment of a really close-knit, fairly tight family. So we see moments throughout the reign when he must have been tempted to oppose his father. Henry begins to fall out with some of his barons, most notably Simon de Montfort, again, someone who cropped up a fair bit in the Henry III episode. And we know that in the late 1250s, Edward sort of flirts with Simon de Montfort's rebellion. He agrees with Simon about the provisions of Oxford, which are sort of imposed on Henry and are an effort to restrict his behaviour and reform some of his behaviour too. But that's kind of the only instance that we really see Edward going against his father very publicly like that, he very quickly withdraws from those agreements and moves back into his father's camp, and becomes very much his father's kind of main supporter, a mainstay of Henry III's government. If Henry III is the thinking man's king, then he needs a strong arm to go out there and do everything for him. Henry is obsessed with Edward the Confessor, this idea of being a saintly king and everything else. Henry's really not a fighting man, but what he has in his oldest son, Edward, increasingly is someone who can be that strong arm of his government. And they are close enough that Henry, leans really heavily on Edward in a way that you quite often would see kings being wary of doing with their sons. We think Henry II, not particularly wanting to give too much power to his sons and all of those kinds of things. Here is a situation where Henry III is very, very happy to lean very heavily on his son and trusts him completely. And Edward repays that trust. He backs his father. He fights for Henry at the Battle of Lewes in 1264 and is captured there. He makes that kind of daring escape from custody when he's allowed to go out exercising on horses while he's in captivity, and he works his way through all of the horses, bombing them backwards and forwards, up and down, going, yep, that was a great horse, next. Works his way through it and finally gets on the last horse that isn't sweating and exhausted, and says to his guards, thank you very much, see you later, and rides off into the sunset.
I love that story.
I mean, it's a great story. It's proper Hollywood, isn't it? And you can very much picture those guards exchanging glances and working out who's going to go and break the news back at the castle. But he makes that daring escape and then moves on in 1265 to fight at the Battle of Evesham against Simon de Montfort to try and free his father from Simon's custody. And we know that Edward, raises the army, leads it there. He actually leads it there behind the banner of one of Simon de Montfort's sons so that Simon doesn't realise what's coming. But then this also becomes the first army in English history to ride into battle under the Cross of St. George. This is the first time that association is created. It's Edward who does that as heir to the throne. Not known as Prince of Wales at this point. He's most often referred to during this part of his life as the Lord Edward. So he's responsible for that kind of the beginning of that connection between the St. George's Cross and the English soldiers. He appoints a kind of death squad to go after Simon de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham. And this is a time when in medieval battles, the nobility would expect to be captured and ransomed. The benefit of being rich was that you were worth something. So no one would kill you. They would tend to want to capture you and ransom you for a huge amount of money. But Edward kind of defies that and appoints, a dozen knights whose sole job it is to go and find Simon on the battlefield and kill him and make sure he's dead. And they do kill him, and they chop him up into tiny pieces and they cut bits of him off and send them around everywhere.
Yikes.
They hack his arms and legs off. They reportedly cut his genitals off. They take his head off, and Roger Mortimer sends it home to Wigmore Castle to his wife as a present. If you're wondering what you might get for Christmas, let's hope it's not the head of Simon de Montfort chopped off in battle. I'm not sure what you do with that gift, but
I'm sorry. The private parts show up in a box. And you're like, oh, thanks.
Yeah, who got those? I don't know what happened to those. And then Edward, it takes a couple more years for the rebellion that had been around Simon to calm down. His sons are still fairly active. There are still other members of the barony who feel disaffected. So it takes a couple of years to sort all of that out. And Edward sticks with his father throughout the rest of that. And then in 1270, so kind of at the age of 30, 31, he decides he's going to go off on crusade. He reckons the job is done at home, and possibly the biggest thing that a Christian prince can do during this period is think about heading off to the Holy Land on crusade. And he gets the crusade kind of named after him. It's the Ninth Crusade, but it's most often referred to as the Lord Edward's Crusade because he leads it. And it's sort of it's called the Ninth Crusade, but it's really the end of the Eighth Crusade. It's the post-credit scene of the Eighth Crusade, I guess. and it's the last time that a Christian Crusader army will make it to the Holy Land before the Crusader states fall altogether. So fairly significant, but this is coming at the real tail end of the crusading efforts from Europe to the Holy Land. I mean, I can tell you how Edward gets on there.
Yeah, I definitely, I feel like the Crusades are something I really know nothing about other than what you just said. They go to the Holy Land. But what does that entail? What does it look like for them?
Yeah, I mean, so this is something that started at the end of the 11th century and has been an effort that's been going on by Edward's day for almost 200 years, of armies sort of heading off to the Holy Land in an effort ostensibly to reclaim Jerusalem. So the First Crusade won the city of Jerusalem, set up all of the Crusader states. Then when they fall, you get the kind of Second and Third Crusades go back to try and win it back again. And after that, they're very much like sequels. The First Crusade is the big one that's successful. The sequel's not quite so good. The third part is just a bit of a money-making exercise. And after that, it's probably best not to talk about them. They don't go too well. Well, for the Christians, that is, for the Europeans. But this entails, it's simultaneously an incredibly difficult thing and an incredibly exciting thing, I think, to any medieval person, in that you have to travel thousands of miles across quite often hostile territory. Edward's got to get across France. England doesn't always have the best relationship with France. And he's got to head through places that will be in a disturbed state and may not be as friendly to him as possible. You think about Richard I getting taken hostage on his way back from Crusade. You have to cross all of these territories that can be difficult and not always entirely friendly. It takes weeks and weeks and weeks into months to get there. So that's before you even think about whether you're going to fight. You have to gather all of the resources that you're going to need to make that journey. If you're going to take an army of thousands and thousands of men, you've got to be able to feed them. You've got to have the supplies. You've got to be able to buy more supplies along the route, because anything that you can take is perishable. So all of those logistics have to go into planning a crusade. It's no small feat. When we hear about people taking sometimes 2, 3, 4 years to actually organize a crusade and go, this is why, because the logistics are an absolute nightmare to put together. But it also, as I said, it's simultaneously one of the most exciting things that a medieval person from Christian Europe could do. The idea that you will go to where Jesus lived his life, that you will go and visit the sites that Jesus saw, you will walk in the places that he walked. That's the spiritual and emotional often driver to go to the Holy Land. There is definitely a desire to get land and money, and it's seen as a get-rich-quick scheme for an awful lot of people. Second and third sons of families see this as a way to go and carve out something for themselves. So there are definitely less laudable reasons for wanting to go. But the idea, we get Eleanor of Aquitaine, when she's married to Louis VII of France, they spend Easter in Jerusalem. And that must have just absolutely blown their minds, to be on the site where the crucifixion and the resurrection took place at the same time of year that it's supposed to have taken place. To a deeply, deeply Christian mind, this must have been absolutely astonishing. So Edward is kind of setting off with these two things, I think, going on. He is going to visit all of these places, hopefully. I mean, he doesn't make it to Jerusalem or anything like that. But the intention is to go and be in this space, but also to fight for something as well. And there's that spiritual edge to the fight too. The idea that you're taking back the Holy Land for Christians in the face of an increasingly successful Muslim effort to control the Near East. So you're stepping into war, but kind of religious war. So I think there's a lot going on in terms of organising going, and a lot going on probably in Edward's mind when he's thinking about heading off on crusade too.
Yeah. When we look at religion back then compared to now, I just see them more as religious zealots, and I don't know if that's the right way to describe them, but how religion impacts their lives is so different than the way religion impacts our lives today. Now it's almost, I don't know, I want to say maybe more by choice, and I'm probably going to get hate mail for saying that, But there's such a difference between religion now and religion then. I mean, that was like the center of their lives, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, we it's a fact, whether you like it or not, that we live in an increasingly secular world now. But that really wasn't an option for medieval Christian Europe. It wasn't really an option to be an agnostic or an atheist. You would be an outcast from society if you thought that. So everybody goes to church, and you could be fined for not going to church on a Sunday. Everybody believed utterly in what the Bible said, and that, there was this idea of heaven and hell and purgatory. They were absolutely a reality of people's lives. So the idea, the First Crusade had been its success in gathering together men had largely been built on the fact that the Pope said, if you die on crusade, even if you die on the journey on the way there, let alone fighting for the cause, you will go directly to heaven. Like, do not pass go, do not collect $200. It was like a free pass directly into heaven. And can you imagine for someone like Edward, who, has fought on battlefields and killed people, the idea that you could get this free pass to heaven if you died doing this is hard sometimes for us. I think as I say, if you're more secular minded, it's hard to grasp exactly what that would have meant to somebody in the medieval period.
Yeah. One of the things when you were just talking about that struck me was that, I think we're so used to living in modern day that we sometimes forget they didn't have canned goods back then. So when they're preparing for this trip, they have to think about those things. Like you said, planning in advance. It's not like they could load up a sack with a bunch of canned vegetables so that they're ready. No, it was fresh.
Yeah, you're taking whatever you can get. Bread is probably going to last longer than a lot of fruit and vegetables and stuff like that, but it's still not going to last forever. I did quite a chunk of work on the logistics of the First Crusade, which is part of a partnership thing we did at work. And we looked at the logistics of the First Crusade. And because, again, you're moving with so many men who are all on horses. All those horses have to eat, and all those horses have to drink. Yeah. All the carts that are carrying the supplies are pulled by oxen, which means you need more supplies because the oxen have to be fed and watered as well. And what you see in the First Crusade is these kind of inflationary bubbles popping up wherever the army stops, because they buy up everything in sight. They will buy up as many supplies as they possibly can, leaving nothing for the rest of the local market. So prices go absolutely through the roof, and this inflationary bubble just moves along the route with the army. So you quite often see on the way to crusades that armies will split up and go by different routes to avoid precisely that, so that there is enough supplies for everyone and they don't cause these problematic inflationary bubbles everywhere. But yeah, you couldn't take more than 4 or 5 days worth of food in any one go. Maybe your bread would last a week if you're lucky.
Wow. Okay. So I don't know if in England you guys are familiar with the game Oregon Trail. Is that for no? Okay. So when we were kids, there was this game that was created, and I actually think it was created in the state where I'm living right now, Minnesota. It was called Oregon Trail, and it was all about the pioneers who wanted to discover land west and, have their own property. And the game is basically preparing for your journey. And you have, the only reason why I'm talking about this is because I recently discovered my CD-ROM for this game and played it again recently. And I was like, wow, this brings back a lot of memories. But you have to you have to build a team, and then you have to decide if you want oxen or horse, and how, how much food that you're bringing. You decide all of these things. And when you were talking about that, it just reminded me of Oregon Trail and how you have to be prepared, but also like how people just died of the strangest things on this journey. Somebody could fall off a wagon and break a leg, or, they could get fever, or they could catch any number of diseases along the way and die, because this is before, there was really the medicines to save them. So it really wasn't much different for them on a crusade then, was it?
No, not really. I mean, this is the days before travel vaccinations. You are not going to your GP and getting a whole load of vaccinations for wherever it is that you're traveling to. You're going to be exposed to a whole bunch of germs that you've never come across before. And that's probably true of the whole journey there, let alone when you get to the Holy Land. You think of a night from England, and I'm looking out of my window here at the rain on the window and the mist outside, and you think, compare that to fighting in a desert in the Holy Land. In many ways, they were so completely unprepared for what they were going to have to face out there, particularly the first time that they went. It was an entirely different world. So you're dealing with the difficulties of traveling, the difficulties of disease, and the difficulties of disease that come with the traveling as well, let alone the diseases of the places that you're going to, stuff like dysentery affecting armies and all of that kind of thing. And then you're moving into a terrain that you're completely unfamiliar with and fighting in a heat that your armor and your outfit was never ever designed for.
This sounds absolutely miserable. The other thing that I'm always curious about is like maps. How did they know how to get there? Was there just this path that everybody knew, just follow this path and there's signs? Or how did that work? Do you know?
I most often travel in the medieval period is around getting to a town and asking where the next town, you would have a series of plotted places that you needed to get to travel there. And you would, as far as possible, you'd like to stay on a big main road, particularly if you've got a huge convoy of wagons behind you. You don't want to get onto the muddy tracks and off the beaten track if you don't have to. But quite often it's a case of getting to a big town or a big city and saying, right, from here I need to go to there. What's the best road to get me there? Which becomes slightly tricky because medieval people could be slightly wary of travelers, people from outside the town. If you're asking for directions, you clearly don't live there, so you're sort of signposting the fact that you're not a local, and that could lead to a degree of suspicion. People on pilgrimage routes and perhaps often routes to the Holy Land and things like that might be used to this more than other people, but medieval people could be very wary of strangers. So, and asking directions marks you out as a stranger.
Obviously. But then again, they probably wanted to get them the hell out of their town too. So they're like, head north, please, 10 miles.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, the best way to get rid of the stranger is just tell them to go somewhere.
That's right. Well, obviously they made it, like enough people were able to make it there. So it worked out okay. After the crusade, when they came back, before I go to that, was there anything else that you wanted to say about their journey there?
Maybe not about their journey there, but there's a very interesting incident that happens to Edward while he's there.
Oh, yes. Please tell us about that.
Militarily, it's not a huge success. So they hang around Acre a little bit, march up and down a bit, have a few fights, and end up making a 10-year truce with Baibars, who is the Muslim leader in the area. It's actually a truce that was meant to last for 10 years, 10 months and 10 days for some reason. I don't know, someone like the number 10. But Edward then is in June 1272. So he's thinking about leaving the Holy Land. His brother Edmund has gone with him, and Edmund goes home as soon as this treaty is signed. Edward seems to want to hang around to make sure the treaty is going to hold properly before he sets off back home. So June 1272, which is the month after the treaty is signed, Edward is sleeping in his room one night, and he is suddenly woken because he seems to have realized that there was a presence, something was in his room. And he wakes up to find someone over his bed with a dagger about to stab him. And it turns out this guy is a genuine actual assassin, like a proper assassin from the assassins groups from the old man of the mountain may have sent him. So not just an assassin in the sense that he was trying to murder Edward, but an actual professional assassin. And this guy tries to stab Edward, and Edward, wrestles with him and fights him off. And Edward he's a big guy, 6'2", gets that nickname Longshanks, which means either kind of long legs or long shins or something like that. But very tall, very powerfully built man who knows how to fight. And he ends up kind of, wrestling in the middle of the night with this assassin on his bed, which sounds weird, doesn't it? Wrestling the assassin on his bed in the night. And Edward manages to kill this assassin that's come after him, this professional trained killer has snuck into Edward's room in the middle of the night, tried to kill him in his sleep, and Edward has barehandedly, single-handedly beaten this man off. But he is caught by the dagger, which turns out to be a poisoned dagger. So Edward is made quite seriously ill by this attempt on his life, and he has to spend some time on Sicily in an effort to recover from that wound on his way home. So, I mean, it's pretty cool to have fought off an assassin, survived an assassination attempt, and single-handedly killed an assassin who was trying to murder you, and then recovered from the poisoned dagger that he stabbed you with. So I think that makes Edward a little bit cool at this stage.
Yeah. Like they were so brutal back then. They're like, well, I could stab him to death, but let's put some poison on the end of the dagger too, just in case.
Yeah, why not? Why not?
It just seems so. Anyway, okay, so he fights off his assassin. He survives the poison. They're heading back to England. Is there do they know the success in England at this time that he achieved, or do they come back and tell them, hey, we made it, we did this treaty and all the above?
Yeah, I mean, messengers would definitely have gone ahead. So his brother Edmund has gone home, who can take the news of the treaty. It's not the most successful a crusade could possibly have been, but there's hopefully going to be 10 years of peace. And Edward will spend time later in his career desperately trying to refocus European leaders on the idea of a crusade. So he clearly, I think, envisages this as just a temporary truce, as a break in the fighting rather than the end of the crusading era. He knows, I think, he needs to go home and regather, resources, and refocus European minds on the crusade. But he actually, while he's in Sicily in 1272 recovering from that assassin's wound, a message actually reaches him from England that his dad, Henry III, has died while he's away. And the same letter tells him that Edward's own son, John, has also passed away. So he's lost a son and a father while he's been off on this crusade. But Edward ends up taking a long time to get back home. It's 1274 before he makes it back to England for his coronation. So there's almost 2 years in which he is king of England, but isn't in England. And this is partly because he's secure enough to do that because Henry III has changed the law so that as soon as Henry III dies, Edward succeeds, and it doesn't need the coronation to confirm that, which it had always needed before. Theoretically, in the past, when a king died, well, not theoretically, in practice, when a king died, there was an interregnum immediately until the coronation of the next king. And Henry had changed the law so that as soon as he died, in the instant that he died, Edward became king even without undergoing his coronation. So for the first 2 years of his kingship, Edward wasn't in England at all and doesn't get back till 1274 for his coronation.
That seems crazy. When we look at his predecessors, it was like they were all secretly killing each other in order to become king. And then there were these 2 years where he wasn't even there. I'm really surprised that nobody tried to take the throne from him while he was gone. It seems unbelievable.
I mean, I wouldn't try and take the throne from Edward. This 6'2", very, very angry man who knows how to fight and has just beaten up an assassin and survived the poison on his blade. I think I'd be like, yeah, I can wait. You can be king. That's fine.
Okay, so out of curiosity, when he went on this crusade, was he already married?
He is married. So he's been married since 1254. He marries Eleanor of Castile, and this is a marriage that his father, Henry III, arranged because Henry was concerned about Castile attacking Gascony, so that bit of southwestern France that England still controlled. And Henry's way of preventing Castile from attacking was to create a marriage union between the two of them. So Edward is married to Eleanor. Eleanor goes on crusade to the Holy Land with Edward. They seem to have been very close. They seem to have formed a good partnership together. It's always tricky to talk about love. Whether they loved each other or not, I don't know. What I always say about couples like this is that we can say that they worked incredibly well together. They had a very good partnership.
And a lot of children.
Yes, which I mean is normally indicative of a pretty good relationship, I guess. But yes, there are a lot of children, boys and girls, and they seem to spend a lot of time together. You know, Eleanor didn't have to go on crusade with Edward; she could have stayed at home in the cold, dank castles of England. But she clearly was happy to go on crusade with Edward. They do seem to have been very, very close. As I say, I think Edward was raised in this really tight family environment, and I think it's entirely possible that he wanted to continue that he kind of projected his parents' relationship into his own, that he wanted to have that close family, that was the example he'd had. And so that was what he knew was how to be a good husband and how to be a good father. Which is an aspect of Edward we probably don't think about when we think about the man who, conquers Wales and attacks Scotland and goes off on crusade and all that kind of thing. Seems to have been a good husband and a good dad.
Yeah, which is quite amazing. And then his first wife ended up dying after childbirth sometime, but I don't know, I was just doing some light research ahead of time, and it seemed like maybe she died from something else other than childbirth. But they had a lot of kids together.
They did. Lots of sons and lots of daughters. They have sons. I mean, there's a John in there, which is not a popular name for the royalty at this point. I mean, King John is Edward's grandfather, so maybe a nod to that. But you can see the Castilian influence in there. There's a son called Alfonso. And lots of these sons in particular, unfortunately, don't live to adulthood. So Edward, who will become the future Edward II, is not their oldest son. He's just the oldest one that survives. There are several sons who would have been ahead of him in the line of succession who don't survive or don't outlive their father to take up that post. But yeah, they have an awful lot of sons and daughters, and that gives Edward a lot of ammunition. Is ammunition the right word on the marriage market? When you're looking to make all of these alliances around the place, having lots of sons and daughters who you can marry off is always a bonus.
Yes, yeah. And then even with his second wife, he had a lot of children with her too, I believe.
So he marries Margaret of France in an effort to kind of secure peace with France. And again, they seem to have been close enough to have several children.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. And we don't have to go any more into the wives because I really want to get to this Scotland and Wales stuff. And I just want to understand. I read a book series, many, many years ago by Sarah Woodbury that was, it's like a novel, basically historical novel about this time period. And I was absolutely fascinated, but it really focused on the Wales side of it and Edward wanting to get Wales. At what point did this happen? At what point was he like, okay, well, I want to claim Wales and I want to claim Scotland? Or was that not even what he was thinking? What was behind all of that?
It's hard to know. It's hard to know what's going on in Edward's mind exactly, but it kind of starts in the middle of the 1270s. So fairly early in his kingship, he begins to have what he would probably describe as trouble with Wales. The Welsh might dispute that they were causing trouble. Henry III had signed a peace treaty with Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, who was the most significant leader in Wales. So Llywelyn ruled Gwynedd, which is the kingdom in the kind of northwest of Wales, and he had managed to secure kind of overlordship of all of the other smaller kingdoms and principalities in Wales, to the point where Henry makes a treaty with Llywelyn and recognises him as Prince of Wales. So he allows him to use this title as Prince of Wales. Llywelyn begins to have problems because now that he's the head honcho in Wales, everybody is aiming for him, targeting him. All of those other kings in Wales don't want to be under Llywelyn. And he faces a few rebellions. There is an attempt to kill him, which is often attributed to his brother Dafydd and several others. And when that attempt fails, they flee for sanctuary to the English court. And this is kind of around about the time that Edward is getting back to England. So this isn't necessarily Edward's policy. I don't think he's in the country when they actually make it to the English court. But when Edward does get back, he summons Llewellyn to do homage to him at his coronation. So part of that arrangement was that Llewellyn would be Prince of Wales, but he would owe homage to the King of England. And when Edward is preparing for his coronation, he writes to Llewellyn and says, right, you've got to come to London for my coronation and do homage to me as you're required to do. And Llewellyn kind of refuses to do this on the basis that Edward is harbouring some of Llewellyn's enemies and people who have tried to assassinate him. And he's like, I'm not coming while you're helping them out, and I'm not going to walk into the same room as these people who want to kill me either.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it seems entirely reasonable, really, doesn't it? And Edward also seems to have got annoyed that Llewellyn is planning to marry Eleanor, who is another Eleanor, who is a daughter of Simon de Montfort.
Oh.
So this kind of rebel earl from England, Llewellyn is looking to marry into that family without the King of England's permission. And Edward is a little bit suspicious and wary of what Llewellyn is up to exactly. And as Llewellyn continues to refuse to do homage to Edward, Edward considers the treaty between England and Wales to have been broken. And in 1276, he declares war on Wales, goes on campaign there, but doesn't really make too much progress. English armies don't tend to do very well in Wales. They can't cope with the mountains and the hills and all of that kind of thing. And the Welsh are adept at guerrilla tactics. They disappear off into the hills, and the English can never find them to fight in a very similar way to the Scots do with the English at this point too. But by the end of 1277, so November 1277, we have the Treaty of Aberconwy, which does see Llewellyn only left in control of Gwynedd again, so that original bit of land in the northwest of Wales that he had ruled, but he's allowed to keep the title Prince of Wales. He's nominally still the most significant leader in Wales. And in 1282, there's a falling out between them again, and Edward declares war on Wales again. And this time he invades and is successful. This is the most successful any English king has been since they've been trying to conquer Wales after the Norman conquest. They have hit the marches of Wales, not really managed to make too much progress further west. South Wales, the Normans had managed to get into and had taken fair chunks of land there. But so kind of central, western and northern Wales had never, ever fallen to the Normans or the Plantagenets up until this point. They just never managed to get to grips with it. But Edward seems to have gone in, this time really, really seriously, made a very concerted effort to take it. Llewellyn is ambushed and killed at the Battle of Orowin Bridge. His brother Dafydd, who is kind of back in Llewellyn's camp at this point, because they're brothers. They might have tried to kill each other at various points, but they're still brothers.
Right.
And sort of united against the English. The Dafydd is captured and taken by Edward's forces, and I'm pretty sure Dafydd is the first person ever to have undergone the punishment of being hanged, drawn and quartered. Edward kind of invents this punishment for what he views as treason. And obviously it becomes much more widely used and becomes the standard form of execution for treason. But this is where it comes from. So Edward here, we are seeing a potentially a cruel streak to Edward here in punishing his enemies and designing ways for them to be punished. 1284, he implements the Statute of Ruthlin, which essentially absorbs Wales into England. Welsh law is replaced by English law. English officers are put in charge to govern Wales. And Edward also begins a process of settling in Wales too. He sends kind of English populations, creates new towns in several places. The most striking one that you can still go to today is Conwy. There is a whole kind of walled town there with a castle at the one end of it. You can still walk the whole of the walls today. And that was just planted there and packed with English people. Welsh people weren't allowed to be inside the walls after the bell had tolled in the evening. Well, if a Welshman got caught in the town at night, he was potentially risking his life being in there. They were kind of banned from towns that were springing up across Wales. So some fairly draconian stuff. You get that whole ring of iron castles that Edward builds around Wales to really cement his grip on there. So this is a series of about 10 castles that Edward invests an absolute fortune in building. Some of the ones that significantly still stand today are ones like Conway, Carnarvon, Harlech. Beaumaris is perhaps one of the most famous ones as well. It never got finished. It's on the island of Anglesey and was meant to be Edward's masterpiece. This was going to be his idyllic castle, his absolute pinnacle achievement, but he never managed to finish it. He ran out of money and then ran out of time. And these are all built by an architect named James of St. George, who Edward brings over from Savoy on the continent. He seems to have met him when he was on his way back from crusade. And James had built some beautiful castles on the continent. And Edward clearly liked his work and brings James of St. George back to England and puts him to work in Wales, building all of these castles. And the castles that you can still see today have a really strong element of Crusader castle to them and Byzantine elements to them too. They are quite often built in a concentric way, so that, you know, if you get in through the front gate, you have to do a loop round so that there's opportunities for the defenders to attack you all the way around before you can get to the next gate. So they're clearly castles that show the influence of Edward's travels to the Holy Land and across Europe. He's clearly been absorbing all of the best bits that he's seen and is pouring all of that into these castles that will kind of cement his control of Wales. And perhaps one of the most significant things that he does is in 1284, so the same year as that Statute of Ruthlin is put into place, his son Edward is born, the future Edward II. He's born at Carnarvon Castle, and Edward seems to have made an effort to have his son be born in Wales. He made sure that he was at Carnarvon when Edward was born. And this is the Edward who will later on in 1301, actually in Lincoln, so not even in Wales, he is the first kind of heir to the English throne who will be proclaimed as Prince of Wales. So taking that title that Llywelyn had been granted and removing that from the hands of a Welshman and gifting it to the heir to the English throne, it was again a propaganda move to position Wales as now being very much subservient to England.
Wow. So Edward was intelligent, obviously. It's really showing his intelligence. And I wonder if a lot of that comes from his travels. I mean, when you travel, it really does, like you say, open up a world to you that you didn't know of before. And his castles kind of show that, like you said.
Yeah, I think so. And here's someone who'd also had a fairly long apprenticeship to becoming king. You know, he'd seen how his father's government had worked. He'd been able to, maybe at a slight remove from actually being king during that period of the Second Barons' War and times like that, he'd be able to see what had gone wrong, what his dad had done well, what his dad had done badly, what points maybe Simon de Montfort had, even if he'd communicated those through the medium of revolt and rebellion. And so it seems to me that Edward had been absorbing an awful lot of this, and he becomes, you know, and obviously, as you say, travelled off across Europe into the Holy Land. For me, he'd absorbed an awful lot from all of those experiences. And here's someone who can draw all of those things together. And I think you can see an awful lot of that in some of Edward's legacy. You know, we haven't got on Scotland yet,
No.
but we can already see a man who is militarily successful.
Yeah.
You know, he's done well enough in the Holy Land to secure a treaty. He's now conquered Wales. But here is also a man who is considered a good governor, who, you know, he's often called the English Justinian. He begins to codify English law through Parliament. So the reason that the English law is made in Parliament and applied at a national level is because Edward I started that process to make sure that everything was uniform across the country, to remove the kind of regional variations in law and its application. So there are some very interesting things that he does. You know, he spends a lot of the kind of late 1280s and 1290s desperately trying to focus on organizing another crusade to the Holy Land. The main blockage to that is a lot of fighting and squabbling between France and some of the Italian states. So he tries to mediate in all of that, and he tries to put all of that to bed to cause everyone to go off on crusade. So he's not just, it's not just that he's a vicious warmonger. He definitely is that. He's capable of going off on a military campaign when the need arises or when he feels he needs to. But he's also doing an awful lot of other things as well. This is a man who is multitasking across, various fronts. He's not letting the administration suffer because he's only interested in war, and he's not performing on military campaigns because he's only focused on the administration or hunting or having fun. This is a man who seems to be able to do and achieve an awful lot. And I get, the other point of controversy that you get around him just before, I'm sure we're going to get onto Scotland. Before we get onto Scotland, the other big point of controversy that you get around him is in 1290. He creates the Edict of Expulsion, which kicks all of the Jews out of England. And this is kind of, he's, I think, here affected by an increasing distrust and dislike for Jewish people. We've seen over preceding centuries, particularly around times of crusade, Jewish populations being attacked and persecuted as part of kind of crusading fervor. But Edward goes one step further, and this is the first time that the Jewish population have ever been, entirely kicked out of England and forbidden from returning. But that's a prohibition that stays in place until 1656, when Oliver Cromwell undoes it. So for over 350 years, it was illegal to be a Jew in England, and that was Edward I's doing. So there's kind of a lot of complex stuff going on. I think there's stuff that you can admire in what Edward is doing and achieving, but there are also problematic elements to what he's up to as well.
Fascinating. Okay, so we got to talk about Scotland. I feel like Scotland and England always have this contentious relationship, especially when we look, obviously, at the reign of Henry VIII. They were, Henry, the Tudors didn't care about Wales, like conquering them, because that's where they came from. So Wales was safe. But Scotland, on the other hand, was this vast land that they could take and this kingdom that they could control. So it doesn't surprise me all that much that Edward went for Scotland. But was it just to claim another kingdom, or did he have another reason to do it?
There's a lot of politics going on here that has been happening for centuries before Edward. So if we go back to Athelstan in 927, the first man to call himself King of the English. So we're Anglo-Saxon here before the Norman conquest. Athelstan manages to secure the homage of the various kings of Scotland. So Scotland at this point isn't a united kingdom. There is Alba, and there's a couple of other different kingdoms as well. But those kings come to Athelstan and pledge allegiance to him as kind of overlord of the whole of Britain. And from that point onwards, really, kings of England have wanted to consider themselves overlords of Scotland as the most significant, the senior ruler of the British Isles, if you like. So they would like to say that Wales, Scotland and Ireland belong to them too by right. And even if there's another king there, that king is subordinate to them. And so there's a lot of flux in this. It moves backwards and forwards. It rises to prominence and falls back again. Henry II, when he first comes to the throne, makes an effort to reinforce the idea that he is senior to the Scottish king. But it's quite often one of those unspoken things that nobody pushes too far. The medieval mind is quite often very good at these kind of, I'm going to say I'm your overlord, but I'm not going to make you publicly acknowledge it. And the other person saying, well, I don't think I am your overlord, but tell you what, I won't publicly deny it. And then we'll all just pretend everything's fine. They seem to be very good at those kind of mental gymnastics sometimes. Medieval popes are absolutely great at not making a decision. If they're ever put in a position where they're very close to having to make a final definitive decision, more than once, a pope just gets off his chair and strops out the room. If they can't find a logical way out of this, they'll just throw a paddy and leave. So this is quite a contentious, contended area, big grey area. English kings like to consider themselves senior to the kings of Scotland. The kings of Scotland don't like to accept that, but also aren't very keen to publicly dismiss it and incur the wrath of the King of England quite often, who is militarily more powerful. Henry III's reign has actually seen a golden age in the relationship between England and Scotland. One of Henry's daughters marries Alexander III, the King of Scotland. So Alexander III is Edward I's brother-in-law. As I mentioned, Henry has fostered this really close family relationship. He gets on really well with Alexander. He remains close to his daughter after she's gone to Scotland. And Edward inherits this situation in which England and Scotland are actually on really good terms. And for the early part of his reign, that seems to continue. He gets on absolutely fine with Alexander III. Alexander, so to demonstrate the point I was trying to make about the opaqueness of this idea of who was in charge, Alexander comes to Edward I's coronation and does homage to him. And Edward's like, yeah, you've just done homage for the Kingdom of Scotland. And Alexander goes home and says, I only did homage for my English lands, which I have to do. So, they're both playing this game of just let it lie and we'll both pretend we've won. Mm-hmm. But Alexander dies in 1286 and all of his sons have predeceased him. So his heir is his 3-year-old granddaughter, who is known as Margaret the Maid of Norway, which kind of gives away where she might be. So a 3-year-old in Norway is now the rightful queen of Scotland. There is a kind of regency council put in place to rule for her, and it takes a long time. It's almost 4 years before Margaret actually makes the voyage to come back to Scotland. And then at 7 years old, she doesn't quite make it to Scotland. She unfortunately dies on the voyage on the way there at the age of 7. And this means that now no one's quite sure who's in charge of Scotland. There are no more heirs to Alexander the Third. And we get a situation where 14 people put their claim forward.
That's a lot of people.
There's a lot of people who suddenly think they have the right to the crown of Scotland. Yeah. And they eventually end up in a situation where Edward is asked to arbitrate, because there's nobody in Scotland who is powerful enough to answer this question. They're all championing their own causes. Well, this plays right into Edward's hands as someone who wants to consider himself overlord of Scotland. He's like, well, of course you've come to ask me. Yeah. I'm the overlord of the King of Scotland. Why wouldn't you ask me? I'm obviously the person for this job. So in Edward's mind, I think this is a real opportunity. He sees this crack, and he sees this way to reopen this question of English overlordship of Scotland much more explicitly. And I think he grasps onto that. And he's now like a dog with a bone. He's going to keep hold of this until he gets Scotland now. Yeah. Two main leaders come forward out of the 14. So they're whittled down to 2. There's John Balliol and a man named Robert Bruce, who is the grandfather of the Robert Bruce. This isn't the Robert Bruce, it's his granddad. There's a kind of council appointed, partly by Balliol, partly by Bruce, and partly by Edward. So obviously all of Balliol's people say Balliol's the rightful king. All of Bruce's people say he is. So essentially Edward is making the decision. And Edward comes down on the side of Balliol, who most likely because John Balliol is the most pliant option. He's the one that Edward thinks he can control the most, who is willing to concede the most to Edward in order to be recognised as King of Scotland. And at one point, a little bit later, there's a dispute in Scotland, and Edward summons John Balliol to Parliament in England to answer some charges about this dispute in Scotland. And John Balliol comes. So he's kind of recognising Edward's position now as overlord of Scotland fairly explicitly. Then kind of seems to overplay his hand a little bit, because he's preparing for war with France. So when we think about Edward's campaigns in Scotland, what Edward would have liked to have been doing during this period of his life is war with France. He never manages to do that because Scotland gets in the way. And Scotland keeps forcing him to draw his attention away from France. But Edward seems to overstep the mark with Scotland when he demands Scottish levies join his English army to go to France to make war. And this is him really leaning into, it's one thing that he's got Edward Balliol personally to go south and recognise his authority. He's now asking every lord in Scotland to recognise his authority by raising soldiers when he demands that they do it. And perhaps understandably, they all say absolutely not. And what they do instead is they make an alliance with France. And Edward is utterly outraged. And I think in Edward's mind, this is now a case of him dealing not with a different kingdom, he wanted to go to war with France as kind of kingdom against kingdom. I think in Edward's mind, what's happening with Scotland now is that he's dealing with rebels, people who owe him fealty and loyalty and are refusing to do that and are rebels against him. So in his mind, he's dealing with traitors. And perhaps that explains some of the ways in which he deals with Scotland, that he's not viewing them as an independent nation anymore. He's viewing them as English subjects who are rebelling against him. And in 1296, Edward invades Scotland. He takes the town of Berwick, which is on the border, Berwick-on-Tweed, and a significant number of the inhabitants of the town are put to death, are slaughtered. So this is already a pretty vicious campaign as it's crossing the border. There's a battle at Dunbar, which Edward wins decisively. And it's at this point that he takes the Stone of Scone, the Scottish Stone of Destiny that Scottish kings were crowned on. And he takes that south to Westminster. And this is why he will have the coronation chair built that has room underneath it for the Stone of Scone, so that kings of England have been crowned on top of the Stone of Scone ever since. His son was the first, and every king since has been. So when you go to Westminster Abbey, if you walk through the big doors at the top of Westminster Abbey and immediately look right, the coronation chair is behind some glass there. Well, that Edward I had that made, and every king of England from Edward II onwards has sat on that chair for their coronation. So Edward is very clearly stripping the Scottish crown of all of its trappings of any kind of independence, and they are all now coming to Scotland in the same way that he will make his son Prince of Wales. He's now sort of trying to absorb Scotland, and he takes Balliol prisoner, puts him in the Tower of London, and effectively deposes him and installs an English government in Scotland. So English governors are sent up there, and this is where I think you get those scenes in Braveheart of the English being incredibly cruel. Whether they were quite that cruel or not, I don't know, but they were certainly resented as, for all that Edward wanted to view these as his subjects who were rebelling, the Scottish viewed it as a foreign invasion and now a foreign occupation with foreign governors put in place. But Edward, for all intents and purposes, 1296, Edward, I think, feels like he's done the job. Scotland is done. It's sorted. It's now in English hands, just like Wales. Isn't this great? I can go and focus on France again, which is what I'd really love to be doing in my 1290s. But it's only a year later, in 1297, that you begin to see resistance emerging under Andrew Murray and William Wallace. And one of the striking things is that Andrew Murray seems to be the senior partner in all of that. He's much more significant nobleman than William Wallace was, seems to have been a much more gifted military leader and soldier than William Wallace was, but he dies early on. And so William Wallace is the name that we associate most with this period of fighting for Scottish independence. They attack an English relief force that's heading to Stirling Castle. So this is the Battle of Stirling Bridge. They allow, they wait for the English army at the narrowing, at the bridge over the Stirling Bridge. I can't remember what river it is. That's terrible. But they need to cross this bridge to get to Stirling Castle, and they wait for it to narrow, and the Scottish army sort of stand to one side, out of the way, hidden a little bit, watching the English army cross. And they sort of, they're doing the maths and they're thinking, yeah, we could still take them. Let a few more across, we could still take them. And when they think that's about as much as they can handle, they just plough into the side of the English army and wipe out that side, block the bridge and prevent the others from crossing. So the Battle of Stirling Bridge famously appears in Braveheart and doesn't have a bridge in it. So, okay.
Okay.
But it is nevertheless presented as a crushing Scottish victory, which it absolutely was. Edward is, again, outraged. He thought he'd put this to bed. He thought he could concentrate on France. And now he's got all of these rebels rising up in Scotland again. And so in July 1298, he takes an army north and fights at the Battle of Falkirk. And Edward is present at Falkirk. This is the first time he's been at a battle since Evesham. And he wins. He defeats the Scots again. And in kind of 1300, 1301, Edward is again campaigning in Scotland, but we now see the Scots doing what they they usually do in these situations, and avoiding an armed confrontation with the English. They're withdrawing into the Highlands. They're keeping out of the way of the English army, allowing them to use up all of their supplies until they're forced to fall back again. So Edward just can't bring the Scots to battle at this point. But by 1304, his constant presence there and his efforts mean that most of the Scottish nobility have paid homage to Edward. They've recognised him as overlord in an effort to get him to go away. I think he's just too persistent for their liking. And at this point, this includes Robert the Bruce, the grandson of that original claimant, the Robert the Bruce that we know, the famous Robert the Bruce. He has submitted to Edward as well. And the year after that, in 1305, is when William Wallace is betrayed by his fellow Scotsmen and handed over to Edward, who takes him back down to England, has a trial for him in London. Strikingly, he's tried for treason, which says he's one of Edward's subjects, which is the point that I think Edward is making. These are rebellious subjects, not foreign nationals. You can't try a foreign national for treason. And William Wallace is executed by being hanged, drawn and quartered, and the 4 quarters of his body are sent to different parts of Scotland to act as a warning against anyone else who might wish to rebel against Edward. I'm just wondering how close I'm getting to the lines in Braveheart now. It's like it didn't work. The warning didn't work. Because the year after Wallace's execution in 1306, Robert the Bruce is kind of there again. We're in a situation where there are 2 main rivals to the Scottish throne. There's Robert the Bruce and a man named John Comyn, and they arranged to have a meeting in a monastery, in a church, to thrash out, how are they going to deal with this? How are they going to get together and fight Edward in a meaningful way? And they seem to reach some sort of agreement by which, whichever one of this is successful, the other will hand over all of their lands and properties to kind of bolster the Scottish throne, so that they're trying to say it's bigger than them as individuals. They're going to try and create this bloc that is powerful enough to rule Scotland behind whoever wins. But Robert Bruce, he kind of liked this agreement because he stabs John Comyn in church and kills him.
Jeez.
Which is one way to make sure that you're the last claimant standing, I guess.
Yeah.
But pretty ruthless. And, this is considered a real blot on Robert the Bruce's character. He's a Christian who wants to be king, who's just murdered a man in church. So he has to go and receive absolution from the bishops of Scotland for doing this. But nevertheless, he manages to convince them that he's the best man for the job, the rightful claimant. He's excused of the sin of Comyn's murder and undergoes a coronation, albeit not on the Stone of Scone, because that's now in London. Yeah. But he's had himself crowned. And for Edward, again, a moment of outrage for Edward. This is a Scottish nobleman who had submitted to him, who had recognised him as overlord, and has now murdered another nobleman and had himself crowned as King of Scotland. I mean, for a guy who just wants to go to France, right. Edward is by now beginning to tear his hair out with Scotland, I think. And, I'm making light of it, but this is an existential crisis for Scotland about whether they are an independent kingdom or whether they are a fiefdom of the King of England. It's a massive, massive deal for them, and they are just not willing to give it up. Edward seems to think, they would go meekly, and they clearly have no intention of doing that. So 1306, in the summer, Edward sends an English army under Aymar de Valence up north, and Aymar defeats Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Methven. And this is that kind of low point for Robert the Bruce, where we get the story about him watching a spider building its web, and it teaches him that he shouldn't give up and he should keep trying and keep trying and keep trying. But it actually, in the aftermath of the Battle of Methven, you get another sign of Edward's cruel streak coming out, in that he captures several key people. So Robert's sister, Mary, is captured and hung in a cage outside the walls of Roxburgh Castle.
Right, yes.
For months and months and months. Isabella Macduff, who is the Countess of Buchan and who had taken part in Robert the Bruce's coronation, is hung in a cage at Berwick Castle as well. Robert's brother, Neil, who was captured. He was fighting a rearguard action against the English to allow Robert's wife and his daughters and Robert and Neil's sisters to escape from the English, and he's captured and he is hanged, drawn and quartered, put to death by Edward, effectively as punishment for what his brother is doing at this point. So again, we can definitely point to a pretty ruthlessly cruel streak in Edward's treatment of his enemies here.
Yeah.
Although I guess Edward would rationalize it as saying this is the punishment of traitors against the crown of England.
Yes.
It's that kind of difference in how he views the Scots and how the Scots view themselves that I think is the cause of him looking quite as cruel. Kings execute traitors all of the time, and I won't say we don't bat an eyelid, but it happens all of the time. It's the fact, I think, that the Scots don't view themselves as traitors at this point because they don't recognise Edward as overlord. By February 1307, Bruce has regrouped. Maybe he's had his little moment with the spider in a cave. We don't quite know, but he hasn't given up. He's come back. He wins at the Battle of Loudon Hill. And Edward, who by this point is 68 years old, is like, fine, I'm going to have to do this myself. I'm not going to get my holiday in the south of France. I am going to have to go to Scotland. He begins the march north, but he's already in poor health by this point. And on the 7th of July, 1307, at Bur-by-Sands, on his way north, his health begins to fail. He's also contracted dysentery, so that ancient problem of the military man during this period. And he passes away on the morning of the 7th of July. There are lots of reports that he asks for his heart to be preserved and taken on crusade to the Holy Land. So his heart will go to Jerusalem. And that's perhaps in recognition of the Crusader vow that he'd taken again and never fulfilled. And that's why there was all these efforts to try and get the rest of Europe to go on crusade with him. He'd taken another crusading vow. There's another source that says or claims that he asked for his bones to be boiled and for his bones to be taken on future military expeditions into Scotland, so that English armies would always march into Scotland with Edward's bones with them. Whether he asked for any of these things, we don't entirely know. There's a slightly more reliable source that gives a slightly less interesting version of events, where he just asks everyone nicely to help look after his son, Edward II, and help him be as good a king as he possibly can be. Nowhere near as interesting as take my heart to Jerusalem and boil my bones and take them into Scotland. But perhaps maybe a bit more likely. So his body is transported back south again. He lays in state at Waltham Abbey for a while, is buried at Westminster Abbey in October 1307. And he has this really plain, again, you can go and see it today, this really plain Purbeck marble chest tomb with no effigy on top. Lots of the other tombs there have an effigy on top. Edward didn't have an effigy put on his. When the tomb was opened in 1774, they found that the body was reasonably well preserved. They said, in quite good condition, considering that it had been in there for 460 odd years by that point. And that was when they were able to measure his skeleton and work out that he would have been 6'2" tall in life. And there is also, so his tomb is famous for having the Latin inscription around it that refers to him as the Hammer of the Scots. And I don't think Edward would ever have thought of himself as the Hammer of the Scots, because he never won that war conclusively in the way that he would have wanted to. But actually, that inscription isn't contemporary, and no contemporary referred to him in that way. That was painted on his tomb in the 16th century. So the Tudors, kind of 300 years after his death, 200 years after his death, gave him that kind of epithet. It's not something that he would have recognised. It's not something he wanted to be remembered by. It was what was painted onto his tomb kind of 200 years or so after he died.
I didn't know that. That is fascinating. Wow. I'm pretty sure I saw his tomb when I was at Westminster too. There's so much to see there's tombs everywhere.
There is. They are everywhere, and his is it's a strikingly plain, wasn't it? Because you look at all of those other ones with effigies on top. His dad is there with an effigy, and Henry V is at the end, and all of these other kings, and all of these beautiful effigies on top, and he's just got this box, just a plain black box. Yeah. With nothing on it. You would struggle to know who was in there. Perhaps this is not a man who is saying, "Look at me, I'm the most glorious king in all of Christendom. I'm the ruler of the British Isles, and I want to be remembered in all of these spectacular and glorious ways. It's a really, really plain tomb, it's interesting to wonder what that says to us about Edward, maybe.
Wow. Gosh, Matt, this has been fascinating. I learned so much about Edward the First today. I still think he's a tyrant, but if you were just to describe him in one word, what word would you use?
Complicated.
Oh,
because there are many ways in which he is a cruel and a vicious man, and many ways in which he feels like an imperialist. He's desperately trying to conquer places. The reason he's so ruthless with Scotland is because he wants to go and attack France. He's having a war because he wants to go and have another war. But you've got the expulsion of the Jews, which obviously is a stain on his reputation too. But you've also got the man who codifies national law. You've got a man who very clearly loved his first wife, Eleanor of Castile, erected the Eleanor crosses when she died, to mark all of the places where her body rested on its way back to London. So I feel like his legacy is it's complex. I think it's contested, and I think it's filled with the problems that we would expect to see with an imperialist drive to conquer other places. That always makes it more difficult to deal with him. So yeah, I think he's a complex man. Yes. Yeah. I like that. Okay. Well, here's your opportunity now to plug all of the other stuff that you're doing, because you're a busy guy. So I can be found over on the Gone Medieval podcast from History Hit, wherever you get your podcasts. I also host the Echoes of History podcast, which is connected to the Assassin's Creed game franchise. So it looks at the history behind all of the Assassin's Creed games. You can find my books wherever you get your books from. There's biographies of kind of Richard III, Princes in the Tower, Henry III, Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine, all of these kinds of people. I will write about anyone interesting from the medieval period. I occasionally crop up on TV and make documentaries for History Hit too. I probably feel like I'm everywhere, which must be really annoying. It's not annoying. And you're also involved in a film that's being made, right? Yes. So we are making a short film, which is designed to be a kind of proof of concept for a bigger feature film based on my novel Loyalty, which is about Richard III. So we've wrapped filming for that. We are starting on the edit. I am spending my evenings and as much time as I can at weekends doing bits of editing on that, trying to polish it up and make it look good. So we'll hopefully have a film that's somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes and tells the story of Richard III when he's Richard, Duke of Gloucester, his first experience of battle at Barnet in 1471. So fascinating. If you haven't realized this yet, Matt is a man of many talents. He wears many hats. Oh, don't shake your head, no. Just as a jack of all trades, master of none. Yeah. I was just going to say, and he's humble too. Well, Matt, thank you so much for joining us again today to teach us all about Edward I. Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me back.
Thanks for listening to Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss a new release. And if you loved it, leave a quick review. It helps more history lovers find the show. Want to support the podcast and get bonus content? Head to patreon.com/tudorsdynasty. You can also find the link in the show notes of this episode. Join the conversation with Rebecca on social media at Tudors Dynasty. Until next time.
This episode is brought to you by Marqeta. When it comes to your payments provider, you can't afford to compromise. Marqeta's modern payment solutions flex with your business without the trade-offs. Stable and agile, secure and innovative, scalable and configurable. If they say you can't have it all, don't believe them. Your business demands more. Choose a payments provider that delivers more. Choose Marqeta. Visit marqeta.com/Spotify to learn more.